Most people think the old asylums of the 19th century were built for one clear purpose: to isolate, supervise, and reform the people society no longer wanted to see. That explanation sounds complete until you stop reading the histories and start studying the plans. Again and again, pre-1900 asylums appear on perfect axes, with central blocks, mirrored wings, measured drives, and grounds arranged with unnerving precision. At first it looks like institutional symmetry, then the repetition starts doing something else. These places do not just seem orderly, they seem positioned, as if they were fitted into a larger spatial logic already in place, long before anyone called them hospitals. Once I started comparing asylum plans instead of simply repeating their histories, the official explanation began to thin out almost immediately. These institutions are usually described in moral and medical language: care, treatment, restraint, reform, recovery, removal from the disorder of ordinary life. But the plans speak a different language. They speak in lines, command points, controlled approaches, ranked buildings, measured grounds, and a kind of spatial certainty that feels larger than medicine. Again and again, the main block sits on a dominating central axis. Wings extend with almost mechanical discipline. Roads do not merely reach the institution, they answer it. Tree rows, boundary walls, airing courts, workyards, chapels, laundries, boiler houses, kitchens, gardens, cemeteries, even farm strips seem arranged in obedience to one ordering principle. At first I tried to dismiss that as period taste. Symmetry was fashionable. Authority liked visible order. Architects preferred balance because balance looked civilized, calm, and rational. That explanation works for a facade. It works for an entrance front. It even works for a grand public view designed to impress trustees, calm families, or reassure visiting officials that discipline ruled the place. But it stops working once the same geometry continues through rear service grounds, auxiliary courts, work areas, hidden circulation paths, and practical zones where display has no real function. Why should patient airing courts sit so strictly on line? Why should access roads, drainage paths, garden plots, and agricultural strips reinforce the same central logic? Why do these places look less like isolated hospitals and more like carefully organized territorial machines? The pattern becomes much harder to ignore when you stop examining one asylum at a time and begin placing dozens beside one another. In county reports, state documents, survey maps, engraved plans, and early aerial-like layouts, the repetition becomes unnerving, a central administration mass. Flanking wings, secondary extensions stepping outward, long straight approaches fixed to an organizing spine, auxiliary structures positioned with a measured deference to the main geometry, landscaped grounds that feel less picturesque, then regulated. Even where the land is uneven, the plan imposes itself with stubborn confidence. Roads are redirected, slopes are terraced, tree lines are planted, boundaries are squared. The institution rarely reads as something that adapted to the site. More often, it reads as something that intended to discipline the site. That is where the first real contradiction appears. We are told these were places of treatment, however flawed, places built to contain mental distress in healthier, calmer environments. Light, air, routine, supervised labor, controlled exposure to nature. That is the accepted language. But the physical layouts often communicate something else entirely. Not merely healing, but legibility. Not simply care, but command. From above, many of these complexes do not resemble improvised medical campuses. They resemble diagrams of oversight, a center, a hierarchy, a balance of dependent parts, a clear distinction between the commanding block and everything arranged around it. They look designed to be read instantly, as if position itself was carrying authority before any person inside the building ever spoke. The feeling deepens once the examples start spreading across geography. In Britain, asylum grounds repeatedly unfold along long, organizing spines, with entrance sequences that prepare the eye before the building is even reached. In the United States, state hospital campuses often occupy elevated or visually dominant land, their axes projecting into roads, fields, work yards, and utility zones with survey-like confidence. Across continental Europe, similar institutions show the same insistence on measured placement, even when their exterior styles change completely. Gothic, classical, brick utilitarian, stone monumental, stripped provincial, it barely matters. The skin changes. The ordering logic does not. Beneath every stylistic difference, the same deeper instruction keeps surfacing. Center, align, subordinate, extend. Official histories notice fragments of this, but they rarely remain with the question long enough for it to become uncomfortable. They tell you that a plan reflects reform theory. They mention cross-ventilation, patient classification, segregation by condition, administrative efficiency, moral architecture, sunlight, circulation, calm landscaping. Some of that is surely true, but description is not explanation. To say a building is symmetrical does not explain why symmetry had to continue across the full grounds with such relentless regularity. To say a central hall improved supervision does not explain why estates were disciplined around long axes eatable far beyond the ward blocks. To say nature was therapeutic does not explain why so much of that nature was organized as if it answered a chain of command. One plan led to another, then another, and after a while the asylum stopped looking isolated to me. They began looking connected, not by hidden tunnels or some melodramatic secret network, but by a shared planning instinct so consistent it felt inherited rather than invented fresh each time. That is what disturbed me most. These institutions were built in different decades, under different governments, by different architects, in different legal systems, for different classes of patients. And yet, the same spatial grammar keeps surfacing. Axial dominance, mirrored dependence, measured approach, controlled visibility, territorial order, not once or twice, repeatedly, too repeatedly. Look closer at the internal composition, and the tension sharpens even more. The central block is so often treated not simply as an entrance, but as a command mass, the point from which the entire institution is mentally organized. Wards are not just attached, they fall into rank. Service buildings do not merely occupy available space nearby. They appear assigned positions within a hierarchy larger than convenience alone. Kitchens, laundries, workshops, chapels, staff houses, gate lodges, mortuaries, and farm dependencies frequently sit as though they have been placed according to status as much as function. Even circulation carries that same tone. Paths channel movement. Courts compartmentalize bodies. Edges feel administrative rather than pastoral. That is why the atmosphere of these plans feels so different from the language used to justify them. The reports speak of compassion, routine, sanitation, classification, labor, recovery. The geometry speaks of order first, not decorative order, operational order. The kind of order that assumes land must become readable, divisible, and governable before any other purpose can fully exist. Once I saw that, the old asylum stopped appearing to me as a sad medical relic explained entirely by reform. It started appearing as a territorial instrument, something positioned within a wider logic than the official story admits. And if that is true, then the symmetry is no longer just a style choice. It is a clue. The obvious objection is that institutions borrow from one another all the time. Architects repeat models. Boards approve familiar schemes. Governments standardize what appears to work. All of that is true as far as it goes. But repetition alone is not what unsettled me. It was the type of repetition. These asylum sites do not merely share practical features or fashionable symmetry. They share a deeper, territorial logic, one that makes the institution feel less like a self-contained building program and more like an occupation of already legible space. The axis is not just inside the walls. It often seems to project outward into roads, field divisions, service yards, drainage paths, tree lines, approach sequences, and the way the property announces itself to the surrounding land. And once a geometry begins extending beyond the institution itself, the question changes. We are no longer asking why ward blocks were arranged efficiently. We are asking why entire estates were made to obey a command line so persistent that later additions still appear forced to acknowledge it. New wings arrive, decades later. Detached villas are added. Utility compounds expand. Workshops shift. Staff housing grows. Yet the old ordering spine remains the reference point, as though everything that came after had to negotiate with an authority already fixed in the ground. In some places, you can watch the institution expand while still bowing to the first logic. The narrative says the asylum was designed. The land suggests the asylum was inserted. That possibility sounds extreme until you compare these places with other 19th century sites whose administrative character is never in doubt. Barracks, reformatories, training colleges, agricultural colonies, state compounds, inspection campuses, and some government complexes often use the same spatial grammar when they want instant legibility and visible hierarchy. A dominant center, ranked extensions, ordered dependencies, measured approach, clear relation to the territory around them. The asylum shares this language again and again, yet its history is usually framed in almost exclusively medical or humanitarian terms, as though care alone explains why so many of these institutions read like territorial diagrams. That is where the next contradiction begins to press. If these places were simply hospitals for troubled minds, why do so many occupy positions of strange command? Elevated ridges, broad plateaus, long visible approaches, open grounds where the institution can be seen before it can be entered. Sites above roads, valleys, rail lines, or towns, not hidden from the landscape, but imposed upon it. Privacy explains some of that. Fresh air explains some of it. Distance from the city explains some of it, but not all of it. Again and again, the placement suggests something more than retreat. It suggests visibility, hierarchy, supervision, territorial presence. The building does not hide, it declares. Official history does provide answers, but they tend to stop just before the real discomfort begins. Reformers wanted order. Physicians wanted classification. Superintendents wanted surveillance. Landscapes were therapeutic. Farm labor lowered costs and encouraged routine. Every one of those explanations may contain truth. But partial truths often conceal larger omissions. What they do not fully explain is why the same insistence on axial dominance appears so often, so early, and across such different political, architectural, and institutional contexts. Why should a language of medical reform repeatedly produce a geometry that looks, from place to place, like inherited state order? That word kept returning to me. Inherited. I do not mean that every asylum sat on the ruins of some theatrical lost world in the cartoon sense people expect from bad sensational history. I mean something more grounded, more bureaucratic, and, in a way, more disturbing. States inherit spatial logic all the time. They inherit roads, terraces, boundary systems, prestige sites, drainage lines, administrative habits, estate plans, and building shells. They inherit old order, then rename it. A place designed for one purpose can be repurposed so completely that the new records replace the old memory while the geometry survives almost untouched. If you want to know what a site once was, the paperwork may help. But the plan is often less polite and far more honest. Seen from that angle, the pre-1900 asylum begins to look less like a purely medical invention and more like a later occupant of a larger planning tradition. In some cases, that may have meant direct reuse of earlier estates, military grounds, monastic properties, administrative campuses, or survey-ordered land. In others, it may have meant copying a spatial template whose original rationale had already faded, but whose authority remained embedded in institutional design. The result is the same. By the time the asylum enters the documentary record, the geometry often feels overqualified for the official purpose. Too formal for mere care, too ranked for mere therapy, too territorial for an improvised response to mental distress. What I keep returning to is the mismatch between the language and the land. Read the reports and you are given treatment, recovery, routine, discipline, moral improvement, humane order. Study the plans and you encounter ranking, visibility, command, subdivision, and an almost administrative confidence that the site belongs within a wider governed landscape. Not necessarily a conspiracy in the modern theatrical sense. Something older than that. Something colder. A planning culture in which institutions were placed as readable nodes inside systems of oversight, labor, circulation, and territorial control. Once that thought takes hold, the axes stop looking ornamental. They begin to look like traces, and traces are often all that remain when explanations are rewritten. A state can rename a site. Administrators can redefine its purpose. Histories can soften the institution into a morally legible story about medicine, reform, and progress. But geometry is stubborn. A main approach still tells you what the land considered its front. An alignment still tells you where authority was meant to sit. A subordinate building still reveals its rank. A long spine still tells you how the property expected to be read. Long after the language changes, the plan keeps speaking. So what were these places part of? I am not claiming that every asylum belonged to one single hidden empire or some neatly labeled vanished civilization. Reality is rarely that convenient. But the recurrence of these commanding axes suggests that many of these institutions were folded into a larger territorial logic than their official histories are willing to admit. Perhaps they inherited command sites. Perhaps they occupied older administrative lines. Perhaps they expanded over prepared ground whose first logic was not medical at all. Perhaps the asylum was the later story, placed over an earlier framework that had already organized the land long before patients arrived. That would explain why the strongest examples feel so unsettling. They do not merely look severe. They look pre-decided, as if the institution arrived to occupy a sentence already half-written. The central block takes its place. The wings obey. The roads answer. The fields fall into rank. The boundary clarifies. And the asylum, whatever its declared purpose, begins to resemble a component of something extending beyond itself. Which leaves the question that official history rarely wants to ask. When we see the same disciplined axes, the same measured grounds, the same commanding placements repeated across pre-1900 asylums in different nations, are we really looking at hospitals that happen to like symmetry? Or are we looking at later institutional uses layered onto an older grammar of land, placement, hierarchy, and control? The buildings are still there. The approaches remain. The grounds still remember the line, and the longer you study them, the harder it becomes to believe that all of this order was created only to confine the forgotten, when it so often feels as though the forgotten were placed inside a system that was already waiting for them.